Hello, everyone. Welcome to another collaboration episode between ByteGuan and East 8. My name is Robert Wu. I'm the founder of ByteGuan newsletter. With me is my co-host, Johnny Zhou, founder of East 8 newsletter. We try to meet every 1 week or 2 weeks to talk about the important events of the last few weeks. And so last time we met was 2 weeks ago. A number of things have been happening. And so we decide to meet again today to talk about these events as two friends. I think, Johnny, for the last 2 weeks, I think one of the most important events that is happening is the aftermath of the Geneva talk. So the US China trade temporary truce after the Geneva talks. And then there has been increasingly more signs of the talks falling apart, which, to your credit, is exactly what you predicted last time we met. So the especially last week, right? There are many news stories of U.S., especially Trump, complaining about China is not complying with the agreement, quote unquote agreement in Geneva, that China is going to lose the controls on rare earth metals. While yesterday there was a Wall Street Journal report basically implying that because China was also complaining about the US issuing the Huawei Ascent guidance, which we also talked about last time. And then there was also stories of the US restricting jet engine technology and EDA software, restricting their export to China as well. And there's a lot of tit for tat. So it does seem the negotiation between China and US is about to collapse. That's at least the feeling of it from the outside. And not just because all these tit for tat, but also because it used to be just about tariff, right? Which is numerical, which is quantitative, and it's easy to reach a conclusion on that. But now we are entering the stage of non-tariff issue, and it becomes a bit hazy, right? It's hard to reach some kind of conclusion on this type of measures and countermeasures. So I feel worried about the situation right now. What's your thinking on it, Johnny?
It's never about the tariff in the first place. I think tariff is just from day one, from Trump administration's perspective, a means to an end, right? Because it could affect a lot of people in terms of goods trade. But I do think that if you look at the Trump won a negotiation with China, it started with tariffs, but it ended up having a lot of clauses that are non-tariff related, could be related to exchange rate, could be related to overall loosening of the sort of state control and all that, right? So I think from Trump's perspective, it's never about tariffs from day one. And that's why I think it's so fragile, the truce it is. And I think both sides are really buying time for each other to launch another attack, or at least from the US side, it seems to be like it. I'm not so surprised about the Trump tweet that the China side is acting slow and all that. But the China side also has its sort of reason to do that, given all these non-tariff measures are being targeted at multiple industries within China. So I'm not super surprised. I think it will eventually fall apart, but there may be some silver lining first half of June. Say if they really manage to have a call with each other between the two heads of state, which is still widely anticipated by some. No one knows if this is happening or not. But let's say if that happens and there's a talk and then Trump can show off Trump's tweet and saying, oh, I just had a call with China's president and everything is sorted out and then we'll see. And then all that, right? So that could happen. So let's really anticipate from a more optimistic point of view if the two head of state had a talk. But if this is not happening, then I do see the whole thing really falls apart. You see the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, also tweeted or noted that basically this whole thing is going a little bit slow, and he's really needing the both sides head of state to have a higher sort of a push on both sides. And this shows that he is also quite helpless in this matter. So yeah, that's my overall take. There could be some optimistic things happening in the next 2 weeks, but it doesn't mean anything. I think eventually it will still fall apart.
Yeah, and it become important to track Truth Social posts. Just imagine the number of hedge funds and quantitative funds tracking that social media with all the AI and scraping technology. Yeah, it's crazy. And amid all of these uncertainties is this specific policy about the State Department is going to aggressively revoke Chinese student visas for the students who are quote unquote linked to Chinese Communist Party, which is in shocking news. And it's also quite almost comical to me that it seems like the White House is linking this to the trade deal, that they will think that this kind of policy would exert pressure on Beijing to comply. While you and I, both of us, were college students in the US. Had we still been the college student and we had this policy, we might be just revoked visas. And we know, I don't know about you, but I know Beijing cared nothing about us. Revoking this, it's just it's like a shoot in their own face without hurting anything about China. It's to me, it's just, I have to say this, it's just stupid, but also totally risk. That thinking that having thousands, hundreds, thousands of students, Chinese students in the States is somehow a advantage to China, not an advantage to the US. And so if they reversed, that would hurt China. This kind of logic is really, I don't know how come they have come up with this kind of thing.
It all started with the Harvard thing, right? I think the Harvard thing is more like a liberation tariff type of move, which is attacking all of the global students. It's not just targeted towards China, right? And then somehow the big genius, Marco Rubio, just escalated this into like a targeted attack towards Chinese students in the US. But I would say that I don't want to see myself to be like a talking things after a certain fact, but I'm not surprised because I still remember back in the days when I was applying student visa for the US, and there are people who talk to us and saying, oh, there is a certain probability that you could fail this sort of visa interview. The reason being that when I applied the visa, I think it's in the early 2000s. And because of the 9/11 sort of attack on the US, there's a massive sort of scrutiny on the overall measures taken over for foreign students going to the US. So there's more checks, more this or that back in the days. So that's why, yeah, even if the 9/11 attack has been away for a while, when we were applying for a student visa, there's still a high probability that you could fail. And so, well, the 9/11 basically were history. And then after the 2008 financial crisis, then the US has a existential crisis. And then I believe there's also a period where the US-China relations becomes really good. And then there's this 10-year visa thing, right? This 10-year visa thing basically facilitated a lot of people able to do business travels and also a type of a loosening on overall student visa. And I think it is after 2008 or 2010-ish that it has really exploded the Chinese students in the US in terms of number. But Now it's a different scenario, given that after Trump won, especially after Trump won, that China was, is being deemed as enemy by both the Democratic as well as the Republican Party. And then we have such a kind of a Secretary of State that was really antagonistic towards China on different fronts, right? It is what it is, but the visa sort of a free policy is never a given, or the visa sort of a loosening is never a given. Whenever the geopolitics change, whenever there's sort of a worsening bilateral relations, then there will be measures like this. But this is, of course, very extreme right now. I think what the US administration is trying to say is that, oh, China would want to learn more about US technology, and thus they will back that in the sort of whole trade package. But I don't understand that actually the whole sort of sentiment, as well as even the perspective towards overseas students, has completely flipped over the last 3 to 5 years. And this is definitely it's also very sad if you're a supporter for US-China relations, because if you want US-China relations to be good, then obviously these students are the best bridge to bridge the relations, right? And
Yes.
then it seems like they don't care anymore. But this thing that this could be a bargaining chip is exactly the reason why you have misread the whole situation. And this is the reason you don't know about the Chinese mentality right now.
Yeah.
And I think it's just sad. Again, if you look at from a longer point of view, it's never a given that U.S. should issue so many visas towards Chinese students going to the U.S.
Yep, it's pretty sad. So let's maybe switch gear to some other issues domestically. So actually, a few interesting things have been also happening on the domestic front in China. I will start maybe with I would say a little bit surprising news about the investigation into Mr. Bi Jingquan, who was a very famous ex-regulator of food and drugs in China. I think that was between 2015 and 2018. It was only 3 years that he stayed as that role, but from what I understand from my friends in the healthcare industry or the healthcare investors, he may be the most consequential Chinese drugs regulator in the whole history. There are many remarkable performance results from his tenure. Basically, before that time, there was massive backlog of drug applications, most of which are not up to standard. But he launched huge reform that make the whole process more scientific and also better suited to what the kind of regulation should be about. And it also heralds a era of the innovative biotech medicines. So I'm not expert in the medical industry. I think I only know the rough contours. But I know, Johnny, you are a investors in healthcare too. Could you walk us through a little bit about the significance of him and also this news, and also to what extent is not significant, just to provide some context and background material for our audience?
I think his biggest contribution is two things, right? One is for generic drugs. In the past, generic drugs in China is a gray area where there's a lot of, could call the very subpar generic drugs in the market, very expensive. And then there's this movie called, right, I'm Not the God of Medicine, which is talking about a guy who got cancer and he's trying to import a generic drug from India, right? This is also reflecting some of his contribution towards the whole thing, is that he launched a new measures called the consistency evaluation, which means that, okay, no matter what, as long as you're a generic drug, you need to be basically look at your performance, right? versus the top drugs in this area, in a certain subsector or whatever. And this has brought a lot of change towards the generic drug industry that basically removed a lot of subpar drugs out of the market and making this thing more regulated and helpful for Chinese patients. And I think in this regards, he did a lot, or he's the key guy to make sure that works. The second thing I think you just pointed to is that you can call it a explosion of Chinese biotech companies, right? I think before 2015, I think when Robert, you are working in the Hong Kong sort of capital markets, if you're talking to portfolio managers, most people are trading very traditional stocks in terms of from a healthcare industry perspective when in regards to China. There's all these large pharma companies, the state-owned or privately owned, but it has been there for 20 to 30 years. Not a lot of origination of drugs, a little bit dated in terms of R&D. But then he sort of encouraged a lot of biotech companies to be able to get their drugs on the shelf as soon as possible. And also this has coupled with the reform of the Hong Kong capital markets in terms of being able to IPO some of the companies on Hong Kong Stock Exchange is a special board called the 18A. And this sort of reform also brought a lot of change to the whole industry, where there's additional supply when it comes down to new biotech sort of drugs and all that. I think this is a very influential thing. And even till today, I think if you look at the whole China biotech space, it's still very vibrant. And the reason for that is because of the able to expedite all the drugs shelving by Jingquan. So I think after he was arrested, there's a lot of comments on actually he's a good guy and all that. But then this is getting into a complicated area, which is related to politics, right? The two things that I just mentioned is more related to the industry, where he has done real efforts and contribution to the whole thing. But because of this drastic change of sort of the reform, both for generic drugs and for biotech industry, there's certainly a lot of corruption as well, if you think about that, from a Chinese sort of bureaucratic point of view. Let's just raise one example. Why did certain biotech companies get certain drugs earlier than the others? If you think about from this perspective, then it becomes a little bit of a gray area, or even there's probably why that led to B's downfall, I think. So it's probably partially because of that. And even as a practitioner within this industry, as an investor, I also noticed that when we talk about consistency, right? But there's no consistency when it comes down to, who approves your drug earlier than the others, right? The sort of standards are still a little bit arbitrary or related to the relationships within China. So that is the area where it becomes a little bit murky. And I think probably that B is responsible for that. I think his downfall is very similar to Liu Zhijun. If you remember the Ministry of Railway, he also did a lot to the Ministry of, not the ministry, but the whole railway industry in China. Basically, he could be called as the father of high-speed rail in China. And it's during this area when the whole Chinese railroad becomes a different kind of animal. But he's also arrested because of corruption, because of politics. And it's also because if you launch a new industry like the high-speed rail, you also get a lot of favors from different suppliers. You could get a lot of favors from even who's going to put the bottle of water on this high-speed rail. Could be someone that is of relationship and all that. So yeah, I think these two bear a little bit of similarity. If you look from a historical perspective, I think B did contribute to the whole sort of pharmaceutical industry. But then it's all about politics and something that, it becomes very complicated, and it's a little bit of a shame for himself and the industry, but it is what it is.
Yeah, to me though, it's just a little bit shame that for the few people in the bureaucracy who are really onto something, that really want to create something great and on their own initiative, many of them end up like this. I, it has to be their own fault as well, but it's just sad to know because we also don't know the details. So it's sad to see this. Because I heard tales of before B took on this job, because he was not from the drug right administrative system. I think he was from the NDRC,
NDRC, yeah.
the NDRC system. So when he was appointed to lead the drug administrator, and the goal was actually also explicitly to reform the system, I heard tales of him hesitating, that he knows this is going to be a high stakes, very dangerous job, because the reform that he was about to launch, as you mentioned, at least part of it is going to create huge disruptions to the existing interest structures, right? The consistency test. If it is implemented, then a lot of people will lose money. So if we look back, actually his tenure was not long, only 3 years. And he was basically forced to resign during a scandal in 2018. And I think it was because of the political backing that he had, that he was only just to resign from the post, not to have any other legal or criminal consequences in 2018. And he was retired for more like a ceremonial post after that. But it was sad that 7 years later, something got him in trouble. And very likely is that he did commit some mistakes during his tenure, showing at the same time the system seems to have really zero tolerance for corruption right now. But also, it also sends down some kind of chilling effect, right, for other like-minded people. The very few, the minority of like-minded people who are the doers, who want to create impact. Next time for another system, if they invite someone to lead the charge of another portfolio, I think people will think about B.
But I think it's the same everywhere. Like talking about that, if you look at Elon Musk's resignation, right? He only stays on it for 4 months. And, obviously it's because of stock price, but it still shows that if you're a reformer and you're trying to cut some crack, it's very hard.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just feel pity for him. This, as you said, the anti-corruption campaign is very fierce this year, even fiercer than I would say that the past 2 years. If you look at the amount of officials or ex-officials being removed off their post, even under criminal investigation. And so it is very hard for any reformer in any country to do undergo a complete overhaul of the system. And, it's just the backdrop of what the world is right now. It's undergo a lot of changes. And then if you're like a political figure trying to lead certain charge on anything, there's a lot of, it's a high stake job. And obviously, as you said, the political backing is important. It's probably also a showing that his political backing is a little bit weak. But again, it's always hard for the reformers, especially you try to do something that is so drastic.
Yeah. So the world needs heroes, more heroes, to take on this thankless job. Okay. Yeah. So there's another industry that is in the limelight for last week. I think it's the EV industry. So I think it was started by the chairman of Great Wall Auto, the Wei Jianjun, who made a speech that implying that the auto industry in China is approaching an Evergrande moment. And he didn't mention exactly who he was referring to, but he said that Chinese auto sector's Evergrande has appeared. Everyone knows. So everyone was thinking about who he was referring to, and most of the people's ideas converge onto BYD, the top automobile maker, the top EV maker in China. shares, after hitting historical high, I think this week, it tumbled for the rest of the week. And then there was suddenly a lot of discussions, debates about whether the financing model of BYD is sustainable, whether BYD is basically not exactly selling their cars to the end consumers, but to the distributors, while the distributors are overpaying for it. And then was this huge payable thing and all that. It's, well, I really, again, I'm also not an expert in the auto sector, but I know that the Chinese auto sector is very cutthroat. It's highly competitive. And it's cutthroat not in terms of normal business behaviors, but also because of all of these smear campaigns against each other in the sector. The amount of money that each of the players spend on the PR and marketing, both for themselves and against each other, are massive. It's maybe the breadwinner for majority of China's PR industry in China. Every time something happens to any automaker, the other ones will jump in and to attack it through the networks of influencers and media properties. So always take news about Chinese auto sector with a big grain of salt. And with that said, I think this kind of debates or controversy would not be possible without the context that the Chinese automobile sector, the EV sector, is a bit too crowded, right? The EVs are engaging in price wars for some time. Everyone is undercutting each other. And it's not possible to imagine that in such an environment, you will still have a dozen, even 20 automakers in the market, in the industry. So some showdown moment is near, right? There's already a state-sponsored program to consolidate state-owned automakers right now. For the non-state ones, the most famous ones, it seems certain kind of moment is near. Maybe it's this year that we're going to see some major moments that is not really exactly like real estate. I think it will be totally different. It's totally different kind of model with totally different kind of financing. But in terms of weeding out the weak, maybe we're at this moment, right? Johnny, what do you think? Do you think BYD is Evergrande?
I think it's of a different magnitude things, right? Because if you think about the real estate model is that you need to borrow a lot of money in advance and then construct. And then 5 years down the road, you will know the sales of the property, right? And so the model itself is high risk because of the illiquidity. It's not because of the high leverage. The high leverage is never a real issue for property sector. The biggest issue is actually this lack of liquidity because the thing you sell, people are not buying it anymore. I think the auto industry is so different in that the sales, you can look at monthly, the type of data in terms of production, in terms of sales, in terms of inventory, in terms of supply ship. All of this is quite transparent. And I would say if BYD is Evergrande, then the others are even in graver trouble if you look at really put this in perspective. So I don't think it's BYD is Evergrande in that the nature of the industry is totally different. I would say there's a little bit of a merit to the statement of that guy who I think he just wanted to point towards that the price competition is too much within this industry, right? But the thing is that price competition probably is the only way for a lot of the automakers to really compete, right? Because if you think about the Chinese way of making EVs over the past even 5 to 10 years, the curve is so steep that it replaced so many autos within the country already. And so if you need to do additional sales and without an overseas market, because basically the largest markets like the US or Germany is not open to you, and then you are facing a lot of trouble because you have such sort of access capacity, I would say, within the industry. And then so many players, how do I know that your car is better than BYD or like a Xiaomi is better than Porsche, right? It's just, you're unable to tell that. And then as a result of that is that people will resort to competition, price competition, because pricing is the thing that is this, I would say, the easiest way to compete, and it's inevitable. And that's why I always call for like Chinese sort of industry policy makers should step in more much earlier than this, right? Because if they prevent people from getting licenses of producing EVs, there won't be such trouble. But then there's this thing called the local politics versus the central government, right? Local government wants to build up this capacity because they don't think there's other industry that could really be lucrative or have such great sort of production, such industrial sort of ramp up. And so they resort to opening multiple sites within their provinces. And they also say to the central government that, oh, we're so poor, you should allow us to do that, because otherwise I don't see another way to survive. And then, well, what can you do from a central government's point of view? So I think the industrial policymaker in China has failed to do their job in the early days. And now they're just bearing the negative sort of repercussion of the whole thing, because you just have too many EV makers. I would say even like 10 is too much for this industry. But now this, what, like 100? There are also those state-owned companies, auto companies, that also in the mix, right? And then you have basically a sort of a different players fighting with each other. There's Tesla, there's Xiaomi, there's NIO, and right. And then there's state-owned players, and then there's newcomers. It's not going to be ending so happily ever after within the next 2 to 3 years. And people all know that. They'll wait and see and pray that somehow the Europeans, certain overseas countries will open to more EV in China. But the thing is, you just have too many players, and it is wrongdoing in its beginning.
So what's your recommended long-short strategy?
I will not buy any automakers in China right now. I actually have a view. If you're a fund manager, like over the last 5 to 10 years, people are longing US for the tech stocks, and they are also longing China manufacturing, like a BYD and certain, like a Ningdo Shidai, right? The CATL.
Yeah.
These are the hot stocks in China. And it's right, because China's manufacturing is definitely booming. US tech is definitely booming in terms of results and all that. But in the trade war scenario, and also certain reverse of the whole world order over the next 2 to 3 years, I was a reverse for the strategy really working is to short US stock and short China manufacturing. The reason being is that the US tech has been just growing too much, and they are so all over the place, right? And China's manufacturing is the same, and they became too big. And they thought they are too big to fail, but actually they just have so many capacity that could not be swollen by other sort of demand. And I do see this to be the winning strategy. And the losers in the past, which is like US manufacturing and Chinese consumer stocks, these could be in favor for the next 2 to 3 years. In China, there's an old saying called 风水轮流转. I think that's the norm of the capital market as well as humanity.
Oh, cool. Thanks for the recommendation. And we talk about the similarity or not similarity between the industry and real estate. About real estate, we had a discussion before. I think you had some strong opinions about a real estate developer. It's a Hong Kong one. And
yeah,
New World Development.
You should look out for that.
You should, yeah.
Because it's not in the news, right? I think it's in a lot of local news, local Hong Kong news. But have you ever heard it in the China mainstream news or even the global, like FT or Wall Street Journal? Nobody has
heard
at
all. Yeah.
But
could you illuminate others? Yeah.
Yeah, it has a loan that is supposed to renew. It's 80 billion Hong Kong dollar, which is about 10 billion US. That's a lot of money. And then so far, the status is that only probably 30 to 40% is being sorted out, and they have 1 month left. So I'm not so optimistic about this thing.
It's
So
going to be, yeah, it's going to be interesting because we are talking about one of the four major real estate families in Hong
Mm,
Kong,
right.
which are supposed to be prudent, supposed to be the top quality. It's not like Evergrande, it's not like Country Garden, all these domestic hillbillies. It's all these old money, what we refer to like old money, like in the ranks of Li Ka-shing, the ranks of Song Hong-kai. You're talking about them. That's a pretty bold claim to make here.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think that the biggest thing is, so first of all, there's a difference between the family and the property business itself.
Yes.
So the family could be sound, but the property business could go under. So there is a
Oh,
difference here. It doesn't mean that the family is going under. It's like the property business is under a lot of trouble. But then there's this whole effect on the banking sector. And that's the scariest thing for the whole sort of Hong Kong banking industry, is that certain players like this is going under. It means that there's a lot of downward correction to be expected on the asset prices. And
yeah.
then what does it mean for the asset quality of the banks? But the thing is, it's unlike China, right? And even for China, they just let Evergrande go under because it's just, they're not going to save it. And if China has this attitude towards property developers, I'm not sure if Hong Kong is going to launch a sort of campaign to save them. And if the banks are so prudent and only getting 30 to 40% of the thing done, it's going to be quite ugly 1 month down the road.
Yeah. Secretly, I'm hoping for this too, because it may be the final moment or the beginning of the end for the real estate
Yes.
empires in Hong Kong,
Mm.
which have been
I think so too.
a kind of a choke point on the Hong Kong's growth for a long time. It could be
I
a
think for
sign.
all of the listeners and all of the readers of your newsletter, they're most interested in not the when, not the whether it will happen, is when. So I'm just pointing out that end of June could be a surprising sort of a moment that nobody expected it to come, but then it come. And the thing that I'm worried about it so much is that nobody's talking about it. If there's a lot of people talking about it, then I'm sure something will get sorted out because, oh, there's a risk here, right?
Yeah.
There's a significant thing that we need to get it over with. But nobody's talking about it unless there's some insiders. And that's scary.
Cool. It's just 1 month. It's easy to see how it will end up in the very soon near future.
Cool.
Cool. Okay.
That's
That's
recoming next week.
yeah. Let's see each other next week. Have a good one.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.